Hello everyone. So for my final project, I made a Java UI for a small company, which is my dad's company, which I'm gonna use for this project. I used a GUI using Java Swing to implement the GUI. The GUI, I implemented it into a class called VMP GUI, which it implements the action listener interface. The VMP GUI has three private final variables: a JFrame object named frame, and two JButton objects called button2 and login button. The main method of the VMP GUI class, it creates an instance of the VMP GUI class with the button1 variable as an argument. So I use the VMP GUI constructor setting the frame's objects properties such as size, and it sets the background color to dark blue. The VMP GUI constructor also creates a JPanel, which I used an object called panel with a grid layout of 5 rows and 1 column. A JLabel object is added to the panel object with the text "Welcome to VMP Enterprises," which is the company's name, and the label is centered in the panel. And then I use the JButton object called login button, and is also added to the panel, and an action listener is attached to it. Another JButton object that I had is called button2, and it also creates the panel and adds an action listener attached to it. And then to finish off with the main page, I used the logo label with the VMP Enterprises company logo name, and I created and added it to the frame. So when the user clicks on the login button or the trucker registration button, the appropriate action is performed, which in this case is implemented in the action listener interface. The GUI is displayed in the frame window, which is made visible with the frame.setVisibleTrue method call. Okay, so now we go on to logging into the system, performing different tasks based on the access level, like the manager or the trucker registering to join the company. So to start off, when the user clicks on the login button, the action perform method is called, and this method checks if the event source is the login button, and if it is, it prompts the user to enter username and password using the JOptionPane.show input dialog method. If the user enters the correct username and password, a message is displayed on the screen to inform the user that the login was successful. So based on the user's access level, different options become available, as you can see. In this case, if the user is a manager, a new frame is created for the manager page, and a panel is added to it with buttons for changing the payroll amounts of different mechanics. So when the user clicks on one of these buttons, another input dialog is displayed, asking for the name of the mechanic and the new payroll amount. The code then writes this information to a text file called mechanicweekly.txt, which is a text file that I'm using to save all the info that is input by the manager. And it reads the contents of the text file, updates the information for the selected mechanic, and writes the updated information back to the file. So this code demonstrates how a system can be designed to provide different levels of access to different users. So for this example, it would be the manager. So the manager has access to add more information. Okay, so now this section of the code is responsible for managing the mechanic and office payrolls, as well as adding expenses. So let's go through it step by step. So once the add expenses button is clicked, it triggers an action listener, and it prompts the user to enter the name of a mechanic and their weekly expense amount. So this information can then be stored in a database or file for future use, which I have it saved for a text file. And then the third button is for changing the office payroll amount. So when this button is clicked, the user is then prompted to enter the name of the employee along with the new payroll amount. So the program then writes this information to a text file, which I named the office payroll.txt, as you can see. And after the information has been written to the file, the program displays a message to the user, which confirms that the office payroll has been updated successfully. So basically, this portion of the code provides functionality for managing the payrolls and expenses of the mechanics and the office staff, like the dispatcher, the manager, the mechanics. So all of them are just into different text files, and it displays there so that you know the expenses, or if there's a change in the payroll because they work less days, whatever the case may be. So these buttons are added to a panel, and the panel's name is manager panel, which is then added to the frame called manager frame. So the manager frame is then set to be visible on the screen. The buttons in the main panel are disabled using the setEnabled method in Java. Then I have an event listener that handles the button clicks by the user. So I have two buttons in this code, button 1 and button 2. When button 1 is clicked, it checks if the entered username and password are correct. If they are not correct, then obviously it displays a message that it's incorrect username or password. And if button 2 is clicked, it prompts the user to enter their name and then proceeds to ask the user a series of questions about waste management in the trucker registration page. So the user responses are then saved to a file called trucker registration text file, which I also have text files for the other buttons as well, but this is the one that I'm using for this one, so it just proceeds with this. And finally, after you finish the trucker registration, it shows the registration complete. The save to file function, it's responsible for writing the user's responses to the file. It takes two parameters, which is the question and the response. The question, I have it as a string that represents the waste management question being asked. And then the response is an integer that represents the user's response to the question. So if the user were to respond yes to the question, then the function obviously writes yes to the file. Otherwise, it just writes no to the file. The show loading function is a placeholder for a loading animation that would be displayed when the program is processing the user's responses. Okay, so now that I explained all of the code, I'm going to run the code and see how it runs. So I'm going to press run here. This is the user interface. The trucker registration button and the login, those are the two buttons that I'm using because that's all I needed for the company. So enter the name, Sanchez. I'm going to put no for CDL, yes for DOT regulation, and no for waste management. So it'll save onto the text file. So the text file that I'm using obviously is trucker registration, and it's all here. Go back to the code. Now that we know that works, we go to manager page. And it's a whole different page, as you can see right here. And it opens up. So if I want to change the mechanic payroll, I put the person, so I put Michelle and 888. And for this, it'll save the date, the name, and the amount. So that's like the three things that matter to me when I'm getting the expenses or the mechanic weekly payroll, whatever it is. The expenses again, 870. It's there as well. And lastly, this. Enter the name of the employee along with their payroll amount. So I'm gonna have Miguel 900. So it should display right here, and it's right here. I could have just put Miguel on a -90, but I just wanted to see how it would work if I did that. So that's my code, that's my project. I hope you enjoyed it, and yeah.